I told my wife I'd be gone for a short trip, but when I came back secretly, hiding behind our old fence, I heard her whisper to another man, saying her husband died years ago. Her smile was proud, almost relieved. Mine wasn't. When she sees what follows, she'll go speechless. You won't believe what I did next. Before we move on, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to see how far this voice travels. My name is Josiah Blackwood, though in the small town of Serenity Creek, folks just call me Joe. I'm 60 years old. I've lived here my whole life, working as a carpenter, a craft passed down through 3 generations. My father, my grandfather, their hands shaped wood the way poets shape words. The Blackwood Workshop became a quiet pride of this town, building everything from sturdy dining tables to bookshelves carved like stories. Life, for a long time, felt like a simple, warm painting. Soft colors, steady lines. I had a loving wife, Eleanor, 2 grown children, David and Sarah, and 3 grandchildren who ran across my yard like sunlight on grass. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch, watching them laugh, believing maybe this was the closest thing to a dream a man could touch. But dreams crack quietly. Small things began to shift, like a faint scratch on polished wood, a tone of voice, a hidden gesture, a glance held too long at nothing at all. I tried to ignore it. I tried to be the man who trusted, as I always had. Yet something cold settled beneath the warmth of our picture-perfect home. I never imagined that the woman I spent a lifetime loving would build another life behind closed doors. A life where I didn't exist. A performance crafted so carefully it made strangers pity her, admire her. Some nights I wish I'd never discovered it. But fate, or maybe God, placed the truth in front of me, like a splinter buried deep in the grain. And once wood remembers a wound, you can't pretend you don't feel it. Everything changed the day I saw that crack and understood it would spread. And nothing would ever be the same again. Everything really began about 2 years ago when Eleanor turned 55. The day she signed her retirement papers from Serenity Creek Elementary, I waited outside with a bouquet of sunflowers, standing in the shade of an old magnolia tree. The rusted gate creaked behind her, and sunset laid a soft gold across her hair. I took her hand. "Time to rest for a while," I told her. She smiled, but her eyes looked tired, like someone finally putting down a heavy box. The first weeks were peaceful. Tuesdays, she danced with the ladies over at Maple Hall. Thursdays, she folded linens and polished candlesticks for the church. Saturdays, she laughed over warm tea at book club on Main Street. Sometimes I drove by and caught her reflection in the cafe window, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. I'd feel heat rise in my chest, the way fresh-cut pine warms a room. Then, changes drifted in, slow like new wind. First the hair, curled softer, shinier than before. Then floral dresses, scarves, brighter colors than anything hanging in her closet. "You get older, you dress up a bit," she chuckled. I joked, "You look fine no matter what." But the joke stuck in my throat, like varnish still wet. The phone was what rattled me most. That old thing used to sleep on countertops and window ledges. Now it followed her everywhere, even into the bathroom, resting near a bar of apple-scented soap. At night, it lay face down beside her pillow, screen dark, but somehow watching. One night around 1 a.m., I came down for water and found her face painted blue by the glow. Her thumbs moved fast, her eyes darted. "What are you doing?" I whispered. She jolted. "You scared me. Sarah asked for a pie recipe." The next morning, Sarah blinked at me. "Dad, I slept like a rock." I stirred my coffee and tapped the spoon once, just to hear something honest. Days slipped by. Eleanor left earlier, returned later. Schedules shifted like loose boards. Tuesday dance became a new yoga workshop. Thursday church turned into fan dancing practice. Words piled around her like rope tightening. "You having fun out there?" I asked one evening. She shrugged, eyes drifting. "Old folks gotta stay active. In the kitchen, a new scarf draped over a chair. Perfume of cool cedar clung to it. The air conditioner blew gently, carrying a scent that didn't belong to this house. Not mine. Not hers. Something borrowed. I held my tongue. Southern men are built to endure. I rested my hands on the dining table and felt the grain beneath my fingers, steady, warm. Still, those little signs tapped like a drill bit kissing the center of a plank. One evening, I tried again. "You feeling tired, Eleanor?" She waved me off. "You worry too much. You make me feel old." That sentence struck like a nail bent under the hammer. Another night, a phone chime echoed through the living room. Eleanor hurried, footsteps sharp on the hardwood. I only heard a whisper. "Don't call, not now." Her voice trembled, like someone balancing a glass about to fall. After Sunday dinner, David noticed the phone clutched in her palm. "Mom's pretty into tech lately, huh?" he teased. A blush flashed across her cheeks. She snapped the screen dark and stuffed it into her purse too fast. David glanced at me, a silent question. I just lifted my shoulders. Later that night, I lay awake listening to her footsteps from the bathroom back to bed. Light, very light. Woodworkers know soft sounds often hide heavy pressure. She turned away, blanket pulled up, building a small wall of cotton between us. The house groaned deep in its beams, as if exhaling. Walls breathed. Floorboards creaked. Something in this place whispered to me, "Something's rotting." I sat by the window. Streetlights bled dim circles into the fog. My breath felt thick. The warm glow from the kitchen hung low on the tiles, a thin halo, like a candle about to give up. Small details collided, sparks flew quietly in the dark. My father once said, "Wood soaked long enough rots from the inside first." I didn't want to say the word, but I could smell the early smoke of family drama between the cracks. And something sharper still, silent, cold, the scent of deceit breathing behind closed doors. So I told myself, if the storm wants to come, let it knock on my porch. When it does, Joe will open the door. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me what time it is, where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I tried to swallow every doubt. 35 years of marriage should mean something. Storms survived, summers shared, quiet mornings with coffee and the smell of toast drifting through the kitchen. There's no way Eleanor could betray me, right? I kept telling myself maybe this was just age making me paranoid. But small signs don't disappear. They cling, like the faint squeak of an old hinge. You ignore it long enough, it snaps. One humid afternoon, sunlight crawled across Eleanor's desk. I was sorting through her bills, the faint scent of her new perfume clinging to the paper. That's when I found a credit card envelope she hadn't opened. My palms turned cold. I never touch her documents, but that day, my heartbeat pushed my thumb under the flap. Groceries, salon appointments, then a line that froze the air. The Grand Oak Inn, Asheville, NC, 3 hours away. She told me she visited a sick friend in the next town over. I sat down hard, the chair groaning beneath me. That evening, Eleanor stepped into the kitchen with a basket of oranges, citrus scent wrapping the room. "You okay, Joe?" she asked gently. I swallowed the knot in my throat and nodded. "Fine." My voice was steady, but inside my ribs, something buzzed like an angry hive. A few days later, while hanging up her coat, a tiny slip of paper fell out. I stared at the words. Richard, 82855XX. No last name, no notes, just the outline of a secret. I slipped it into my pocket, closed my hand around it. "No rush," I whispered to myself. "Everything shows itself in time." After that, Eleanor disappeared from home more often. Art fair, special cooking course, helping with a wedding. Each excuse took her miles away from Serenity Creek. I asked once, softly, "Who's getting married?" She paused, just long enough for dread to bloom. "An old friend," she muttered, turning away, as if afraid my eyes might carve through bone. Her phone beeped behind the bathroom door. I sat alone in our bedroom, lamp casting a thin yellow halo on the wall. It made her shadow look like a stranger. When she came out, I asked quietly, "Something funny?" She smiled, tight and nervous. "Friends, talking," but her eyes glimmered with something electric and young. We spoke less. Dinner became a silent meeting. A knife tapping a cutting board sounded like a countdown. "How was your day?" I'd ask. "Normal," she'd say, and never lift her eyes. One night, I woke to find the kitchen dark. The glow of her phone lit half her face. Fingers tapped fast, messages burning in the night. "What are you doing?" I whispered. She jumped so hard the glass beside her rattled. "Sarah asked for a pie recipe," she blurted. The next morning, I asked Sarah. She frowned. "Dad, I slept like a rock." Later, I held Eleanor's phone for a moment. "Accident," I told myself. The screen lit up. R. No photo, no last name. Just a letter. But it cut deeper than any signature. In my workshop, sawdust should have calmed me. The smell of pine and oil usually settles my nerves. But that day, everything felt tight. I remembered my father's words. "Don't ignore a hinge that squeaks. It's warning you before it breaks." Another evening, Eleanor came home late. Fresh curls. Lipstick red enough to stain the air. The yard light stretched her shadow long across the concrete. I leaned against the porch rail. "Good night?" I asked, casually as a breeze. She flinched, just a half second, but enough to drop my heart another inch. "Fine," she whispered. But the smile wasn't meant for this house. We barely touched anymore. A gap of one hand between us in bed felt like the width of two states. Her breathing changed, shallow, distant. The kind lovers give to someone else. One late night, I sat alone in the kitchen. The wall clock clicked, tick, 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 each sound a hammer on my chest. I pressed my palm flat on the wooden table, where she once rolled pie dough, where my grandkids scattered flour. The grain felt rough under my fingers, a scar the wood never healed from. Am I still her husband, or just a background character in someone else's story? The wind answered by slipping beneath the door, chilling my bones. In that moment, I realized something ugly. If a path towards sweet revenge exists, sometimes it's paved by silence, stretched over sleepless nights. I stared at the clock. The minute hand passed 12. I stood, breath slow, shoulders heavy. "Enough," I whispered. "It's time for answers." Deep in my chest, a tiny click sounded, like the last lock turning open. This marriage wasn't cracking anymore. It was breaking. That morning, autumn light slunk across the porch like a ribbon of liquid honey. I sat with my coffee, the steam smelling faintly of old roasted beans, listening to the wind tease the maples at the gate. Everything was peaceful, too peaceful. That kind of quiet makes a man like me feel his heart tighten, like there's a storm waiting just out of sight. Footsteps came hard on the gravel. David, my son, was breathing fast, his face ashen as if he'd seen something wrecked. "Dad, did you hear?" I set the cup down. The ceramic clicked hollow against the wooden table. "Hear what, son?" He swallowed. "Mom, she sold Grandpa's pocket watch." It felt like someone had taken a chisel to the family table. That watch, dull gold, hand-engraved, the lid popping open with the soft sigh of something deeply human, had been passed down 3 generations in the Blackwood family. My father used to stand on the porch and pull it out each evening. Sunlight would draw a bright line across its face. He put it in my hand when I turned 30. "Keep it, Joe. Don't ever let this leave the house." I'd handed it to Eleanor to keep, thinking it safer in the hands of the woman I trusted with my life. "Sold? For what reason?" I asked, voice low and rough. David hesitated. "She said to raise money for a children's charity." He handed me his phone, a web page open. I checked. They don't accept physical donations. And, get this, I called the charity manager. They don't even know her name. Sound seemed to be sucked out of the air. The wind stopped. Even the birds in the tree fell silent. I leaned back. The wood creaked. Or was it my chest? Coffee went bitter in my mouth. Are you sure? He nodded, eyes dropping like the child who feared my scolding for dropping the nail box. But this time, there was no scolding. Just a hollow where something used to be. Something dropping away like a forgotten cellar. Why would she do that? The words left me awkward, like pitching a headless nail at the wall. It slid down, couldn't find a hold. I watched the yard. Maple leaves fell, one by one, no hurry, no sound, just falling as if even time had lost patience. Eleanor had sold something that wasn't only hers to sell. She sold memory. She sold bloodline. She didn't ask. She didn't give me a chance to hold on to my father's warmth. A small action, yet in a Southern family, it's a knife easing under the hinge of trust. That afternoon, Eleanor came home. The door swung open and a new perfume hit, sweet and sharp like a razor. I set my coffee down. Steam fogged the lenses of my glasses. I just ran out to buy a gift for the kids, she said brightly. But there was a tremor in the tail of her sentence. Tiny, enough for someone used to the creak of warped boards in a shop to sense something wrong. Where's my father's watch? I asked, straight, no pretense. Eleanor froze, eyes blinking. Oh, that old thing? I donated it. Children need it more. The answer slid out smooth, rehearsed, but her breath missed a beat. I looked at her. No thunder, no shouted words, just the long silence that equals 35 years of trust. You really think charity is more important than our family? My voice was steady, like a table I'd waxed myself. She curled her lip. Don't be dramatic. It's just an object. Why do you cling to it? I stood. Because my father put it in my hand when he drew his last breath. Every scratch holds a story. It's our family in the palm of my hand. I touched the chest where the watch used to rest, like a second heartbeat. It's not just an object, Eleanor. She snapped. You're old-fashioned, stuck in the past. The words were not soft. They weren't a rose's thorn, steel, sharp. They cut and moved on. As she climbed the stairs, David came up and put his hand on my shoulder. Dad, I'm sorry. His eyes rimmed red. I shook my head. Why should you apologize for someone else's sins? I forced a smile. Even the dead can learn to fake a smile. I sat on the porch and watched the yard. Wind picked up, twirling yellow leaves into small whirlwinds. I remembered nights polishing that watch with my father. Metal and oil under my fingernails, the little click when the lid popped, the soft march of the hands, like the breath of a man who watched over me. And now, one word, sold, neatly tore 3 generations away. I closed my eyes and felt a crack in my chest, the sound a carpenter knows when a piece of wood you thought solid finally snaps. Turns out water had been seeping in for a long time. That night I sat in the workshop, the yellow lamp throwing a weak pool of light. I took out the black notebook, opened a fresh page, and wrote, Pocket watch, sold secretly, without permission, lied, insult to heritage. Ink bled a little. My hand trembled. My heart felt strangely hard. I flipped back a few pages. Asheville. The Grand Oak Inn. Richard. 3 names, 3 thorns. I pinned them into the paper like pins into flesh. I looked up at my father's photo on the shelf, him standing by the shop, smiling easy, eyes narrowed by the sun. Dad, I whispered, I'm sorry I let it leave my hands. The wind at the window sighed and tugged the curtain like an old man's breath. I closed the notebook. I need to know the truth, I told myself. I have to stand up. I didn't sleep that night. The bed felt oddly vast when the person beside you is only a shape, no longer honoring what you stood for. The ceiling was dark, yet my thoughts burned, sharp and cold as newly honed steel. I'm not a man given to violence, but there is a hurt worse than a blade. That is betrayal. And sometimes a Southern man, pushed into a corner, will stand tall like an old oak, roots gripping the earth, ready for the day the storm tries to pull him out. A small flame kindled inside me, not hatred, not reckless fury, purpose. Quiet, but persistent. If family is a doorway, I'd heard the hinge squeal. And when the hinge squeaks, a carpenter knows. The frame is out of square. I clutched my fist. I won't let it rot any further. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate it. Wednesday, 6 a.m. Autumn sunlight slid across the porch roof like warm honey. I walked Eleanor to the door, hugged her lightly, and caught the sharp sweetness of that new perfume again, crisp like a green apple sliced too thin. "Drive safe," I said, voice flat as a waxed table. Her SUV door clicked shut. We watched the taillights disappear down Route 17, swallowed by the morning fog. David and I climbed into my old pickup. The engine rumbled low, rough, like an old man clearing his throat. On the dashboard, the tiny green dot from Family Share flashed, legal, harmless, and clean as a freshly oiled hinge. "Keep distance, Dad," David murmured. I nodded. The tires hissed across wet asphalt. Last night's rain still clung to the air. We crossed the wooden bridge over Serenity River, water smooth as glass, silent as someone holding their breath. A Waffle House sign slipped past in the mirror. A gas station marquee blinked $3.29 a gallon. Radio static whispered, "Asheville, clear skies, high 72. We climbed into the low folds of the Appalachian Hills. By the outskirts of Asheville, houses perched along the slopes, white porches, trimmed hedges, copper mailboxes catching the morning light. The green dot slowed, turned right, stopped. I killed the headlights and parked beneath an oak. Sap hung in the air like warm syrup. Through the windshield, I saw it. A white-walled villa, arched windows, a trellis of roses climbing the porch. Wind tinkled a glass wind chime, thin, cold, ready to shatter. David handed me a pocket binocular. "Stay inside, stay calm." "I know," I whispered. "We stand on public ground, nothing illegal." The front door opened. A man stepped out, silver hair combed neat, navy shirt, steel watch gleaming. Richard Vance. Eleanor's SUV door swung open. A green dress brushed her knees. Her perfume carried on the breeze. She went to him. Their arms wrapped together, too close, too familiar. Not nostalgia. Not courtesy. A practiced embrace. My breath snagged like a broken nail. I lowered the binocular, preferring the pain without magnification. They spoke softly under the rose trellis. Richard's hand found her cheek. She laughed, shoulders trembling with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in years. David swallowed. "Dad, I'm here," I whispered. "No trespassing, no shouting. We stay where the law stands." A neighbor's dog barked. The wind changed direction, bringing the smell of wet rose stems and early coffee from somewhere down the street. I pulled out my black notebook. 8:47 a.m., 224 Briarcrest Lane, arrived, hug, familiarity. No adjectives. Facts don't need decoration. A street camera perched on a black pole at the corner. Good. Everything recorded by someone besides me. Richard returned with 2 steaming cups. They sat on wicker chairs, knees nearly touching. A golden-coated dog bounded up. Eleanor bent, tucked her dress, scratched behind its ear like she'd done it 100 times. A tiny gesture. A big truth. David lifted his phone. Public street photos are legal, right? Yes, nothing private, nothing recorded illegally. Click. One soft shutter sound like a drop of water on cold iron. A delivery truck drove between us for 2 long seconds. Our sightline cut away. When it passed, the porch was empty. They'd moved inside. Silence swelled. The house windows cracked open just enough for sound to escape. I heard one half-word tossed by the wind. Sharon. My heart stuttered. Then the window shut. The wind chime stopped. Leaves froze mid-flutter. David's voice trembled. "Dad, you want to leave?" "Not yet," I wrote again. Not a reunion, no event hall, private residence of Richard Vance. Ink spread slightly across the paper, like water finding soft wood grain. "Do you hate Mom?" David asked quietly. "I don't hate," I said. "I just won't be lied to anymore." At 9:02, we backed away. The porch shrank in the mirror, picturesque, but crooked in spirit. At the stop sign, sunlight spilled through the windshield, bright and sharp. I caught one last glimpse, white curtains falling shut, sealing something alive inside. Some folks would call this the path towards sweet revenge. I call it carpentry, inspecting every hinge, tightening every screw, until the whole frame stops groaning. We turned left, leaving rose petals and ghosts behind. The road ahead was long, and for the first time in a while, I welcomed the distance. We parked beneath the shade of an old oak tree, one street away from the white-walled house. Sap clung to the windshield like thin honey, and the breeze carried the smell of damp soil and freshly cut grass from the yard across the road. The dashboard clock read 5:21 p.m. The sun leaned low, like a golden coin about to roll off the ridge, pouring amber light over the climbing roses along the fence. An air conditioning compressor hummed on the side of the house, steady as bees lost in a canopy of leaves. David handed me a small pair of binoculars. "Just breathe, Dad. We're standing on public ground, all legal." I nodded. Silence stretched between us like a guitar string wound too tight. I could hear my own pulse, tick, 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 in the palm, gripping my black notebook. 2 long hours crawled by, dragging silver trails across the cement like a snail's path. At 7:12, the back door opened. Richard stepped out first, dark blue shirt, sleeves neatly rolled, a steel watch gleaming on his left wrist. Eleanor followed, silk dress and jade green, heels I'd never seen her wear inside my house. They walked down a white gravel path and sat on the stone bench near the hedge. Behind them, string lights clicked on, washing the lawn in warm amber glow, softening the hard edges of the evening. From the public sidewalk, through shifting gaps of laurel leaves, their voices drifted clearly. They weren't whispering. "Richard, darling, I'm so happy to be here with you. I miss you," she said. His laugh was delicate, like glass tapped with silver spoons. "And I missed you, Charlotte. Asheville breathing better for you than that old town you came from?" I froze. Charlotte. A name that didn't belong in the Blackwood ledger. A name that didn't belong in the sawdust of my shop, or in 35 years of vows. My throat tightened, my fingers dug into the edge of my notebook. Beside me, David whispered, voice cracking like dry wood, "Mom just used another name." Eleanor sighed, shoulders dropping, then lifting, like an actress stepping cleanly into a rehearsed monologue. "In Asheville, everyone knows me as a widow. My husband died in a woodworking accident 3 years ago. They pity me, then praise me for being strong. In Serenity Creek, I'm still Mrs. Blackwood, playing my role. I need both worlds to breathe." The words pierced clean, no blade required. I glanced at my son, his face pale under the dying light. His eyes shook like a man watching snow fall in summer. Inside my chest, an old door groaned, the dry hinge of trust. This wasn't playful wandering. This was architecture, a constructed life, a forged identity. It was betrayal. Richard lifted his hand, cupping her cheek, thumb tracing her cheekbone. "You deserve happiness, Charlotte." She smiled, eyes shimmering beneath the string lights. I wrote in my notebook, 7:16 p.m., backyard bench, physical intimacy. No hesitation, verbal confirmation of relationship. In the margin, I drew a single straight line, like raising a doorframe. Each stroke was a nail driven into the truth. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of coffee from the house next door, blended with dew-soaked roses. A golden retriever trotted into the yard, bumping Eleanor's hand. She stroked its head like she'd done it 100 times. Small details, touch, breath, posture, sometimes speak louder than any document. David lifted his phone, camera aimed through the leafy gap. I nodded. Photos taken from public ground. No audio invasion, no trespass. A faint click. In the wind, it sounded like a needle touching hardwood, quiet, but a woodworker always hears. Richard murmured something I couldn't catch. Eleanor leaned closer, answered softly, yet the breeze fed it straight to us. "I've mourned long enough for a man who no longer exists." David jolted. So did I. Half a lifetime reduced to a flicked cigarette butt. I bit down, holding the voice inside my chest. Dad, David whispered. I rested a heavy hand on his shoulder. Not yet. We don't confront emotion. We collect truth with clean hands. My voice surprised even me, low and slow, like an old rail humming under pressure. A glass wind chime above their porch chimed a single note. The sun kissed the ridge, turning orange to bruised purple. Their shadows fused across the lawn, long brushstrokes of ink. Suddenly, Richard called, "Charlotte!" The sliding glass door opened with a metallic sigh. They stepped inside, leaving behind the blinking lights like eyelids swollen from crying. The garden emptied, stage dimmed after the curtain fall. I turned a page, wrote, "Not a reunion, no event venue, personal residence, 224 Briarcrest Lane, routine pattern." Underneath, I added one word, deceit. "What now, Dad?" David asked, eyes fixed on the door. "Stand firm," I answered, "and wait for the right hinge to lift." I collapsed the binoculars, tapped the notebook's cover 3 times, habit of a carpenter spacing dowels. At the edge of the street, lamps flickered on, 8:01 p.m. A delivery van rolled by, its tires crunching gravel like salt scattered onto hot cast iron. We eased back toward the pickup, hiding behind the oak's trunk. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of Eleanor passing behind curtains, only shape, no hesitation. I understood then. The house in Serenity Creek had lost another support beam. To keep a house standing, a woodworker's hands must not tremble. I snapped the notebook shut. "Time to measure the whole frame," I whispered. Starting at the hinges. When a hinge squeals, no one can hold their breath forever. Sunset draped the street like velvet sliding off a table's edge. I felt my heartbeat shift, colder, calmer, precise as a steel rule. Not fury, not flames, but the quiet certainty of someone guiding a saw along the grain. "Let's go, Dad," David said. I nodded. The engine rumbled, low as a prayer swallowed into the chest. The truck rolled forward, leaving behind a beautiful garden, and a truth unsheathed and gleaming like a kitchen knife under warm light. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know how far it goes. I truly appreciate it. I pushed open the small side gate, the hinge brushing out a trace of pine resin from old varnish. Warm garden lights spilled across the lawn like thin strokes of amber oil paint. My footsteps crackled over gravel, sharp, dry, like a saw biting into soft wood. I walked toward the stone bench where Eleanor and Richard sat. "Eleanor," she jolted. Her face shifted. Surprise first, then fear, then that flicker of calculation I'd never seen before. "Joe, weren't you supposed to be away on business?" I stepped closer. My voice stayed calm, the way a carpenter steadies his hand before the final cut. "I came to meet Charlotte and hear her tell me what time I died and in which workshop." Richard blinked, confused. "Charlotte? Eleanor, what is he talking about?" She stammered. "Joe, I can explain." "No need," I cut her off, flat and still. "I've heard enough." Richard raised both hands, palms out. "Mr. Blackwood, I swear I didn't know. She said she was a widow, I thought." His eyes drifted downward, landing on the gold ring on my hand, the ring that now weighed like a block of iron. "I believe you," I said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. The one who owes is the person who killed me in her story long before this night." Eleanor collapsed onto the bench, tears bursting like a pipe in winter. "Joe, I just wanted a different life. Serenity Creek is too small. Everyone knows everything. I was tired of being the wife of a carpenter, the mother of David and Sarah. I wanted freedom, admiration. I wanted to walk into a room and hear people say my name. I let that settle." "Freedom doesn't come from burying someone alive," I said. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The rose trellis beside her caught the last of the sunset, glowing like a confession under a police lamp. Even the wind stopped moving, as if it didn't want to interrupt. David stood beside me, jaw clenched so tight it clicked. "I never thought Mom could..." I squeezed his shoulder. Son, people hide their worst parts where no one ever looks. Richard turned to Eleanor, voice shaking. Eleanor, what have we done? Regret carved deep lines down both their faces like long cracks snaking through water-swollen oak. But regret doesn't rewind. I turned my back to them. Each step I took felt like driving a nail into rotten wood, final and echoing. Behind me, her voice trembled. Joe, I'm sorry. I paused, but didn't look back. Some apologies aren't meant for the one who hears them, I said. They're meant for the one who speaks them. But sometimes, they don't save anything. I kept walking. My shadow stretched long across the stone path, dark as chimney smoke. Overhead, a flock of crows erupted from the branches, like witnesses who finally couldn't stay quiet. David opened the truck door. Dad, what do we do now? I stared at my reflection in the windshield, older, quieter, and carrying a cold little spark in the eyes. From this moment, I answered, we stop running. We measure the wood straight and fix the frame. David swallowed hard. You mean, get even? I shook my head with a thin smile. No, son. Life has laws sharper than any saw blade. I tapped the dashboard gently, rhythm steady as a ticking clock. If they push you into a corner, you rebuild the wall. The truck rolled away from Briarcrest Lane, leaving the yellow garden lights flickering in the rear view like dying embers. In my chest, something settled. Not anger, not fear, just the quiet before a storm chooses where to strike. And sometimes, precise is the only way to keep the rest from rotting. The drive back to Serenity Creek was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that hangs on your shoulders like wet canvas. I kept my eyes on the road, knuckles pale against the steering wheel, feeling my heartbeat thump like someone knocking from the inside of my ribcage. When we reached David's house, I sank down into the old wooden chair by the door. The varnish had long faded, and every shift of weight made it groan like an old man remembering his youth. My hands trembled, just enough for me to notice. Moments later, David and Sarah came rushing in, eyes rimmed red. They wrapped their arms around me, holding tight. No words, none were needed. Sis. We all understood. We wouldn't return to the lives we had in the morning. 2 days later, Eleanor came home. Knocking softly at first, then harder. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she begged, voice cracking like old timber. She said she didn't want to lose the family. She said she regretted everything, but regret is a currency that only spends if you offer it before the damage is done. I rose slowly, looked into those familiar eyes, and said, calm and steady, the day you told someone else I was dead, this marriage died with me. There was no shouting, no broken plates, just a door closing on a story that no longer belonged to the two of us. I reached out to Attorney Mason Harrow, the kind of man whose glasses always catch courthouse light and whose briefcase smells faintly of old leather and ink. He specialized in property disputes around these parts, with hotel receipts, the scrap of paper with Richard's name and number, Richard Vance's sworn testimony, and evidence of Eleanor selling my father's pocket watch without consent. The divorce petition went straight to Bluestone County Court. The hearing was quick, quiet, clinical. Richard stood in the witness box, voice steady, shame sitting behind every syllable. He admitted he had no idea she'd declared me dead in her other life. Eleanor sat stiff, fingers knotted until her knuckles turned blue, staring past the judge as though she could rewind time if she blinked hard enough. At the end, the judge spoke, firm, final. Eleanor would compensate my share of the property, return ownership of the Blackwood heirloom watch, and cover legal costs for the harm her deceit had caused my reputation and name. When I stepped outside, a soft breeze brushed across my face, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply felt lighter, as though a stone tied to my ribcage had finally been cut loose and left at the courthouse steps. Richard approached quietly. I'm truly sorry. I nodded. You didn't know. You were a victim too. He lowered his head and turned away, walking slowly down the path, each step shrinking him smaller, as if shame were sandpaper grinding him down grain by grain. And as I watched him disappear past the courthouse gate, I realized something. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a weight finally letting go. Rumors don't need legs. In Serenity Creek, they drift like morning mist over the fields, cling to wooden porches, slip through screen doors, and settle inside kitchens. The morning after our confrontation in Asheville, I heard whispers outside the grocery store. "Unbelievable! Mrs. Blackwood, really?" "Yeah, told folks her husband died years ago." The wind chimes rang, and the smell of oranges spilled across the floor like thin sunlight. I stood by the wooden counter I built myself, listening to my own name fall from strangers' lips like a loose nail hitting an empty box, dry, cold. Places Eleanor once belonged shut quietly. The book club canceled its next meeting. The group message snapped like a rope cut clean. No explanation. The church stopped asking her to help with the children's hour. The chalk box disappeared into a cabinet, and the key clicked shut. The Tuesday dance group skipped her name like a sewing machine needle sliding off track. At the supermarket, people avoided her eyes. Not from hate, but awkwardness. How do you speak to someone who dug 2 funerals, one pretend in a different city and one real for the trust buried here? I pushed my cart down the jam aisle, picked the cheapest jar. My hands still measured weight like a carpenter, steady, precise. But no one ever taught me how to cut off a rotten piece of memory without slicing the heart along with it. On Thursday afternoon, Richard called. His voice broke like glass hitting tile. "Mr. Blackwood, I ended it. I can't stand beside a woman who built a grave for her husband, in her words." I was silent. A draft pushed through my porch, carrying the scent of fresh-cut pine. "I couldn't defend myself," he added, "but today, I want to return the truth to you." "The truth stands on its own," I said quietly, "but thank you." When I got home, I found Eleanor sitting at the table, eyes swollen. Papers scattered everywhere, bills, handwritten notes, and finally, a printed house listing. "Joe," she rasped, "people don't look at me the same." I can't take it." I pulled out a chair, sat across from her. "Pressure has a shape," I said. "Like a warped door frame. No matter how you push, it won't close right." She chuckled once, thin, tired, then cried harder. "If you sell, we'll lose money," I added. "This house has a crack outsiders can see from the street. 3 weeks on the market, and the price fell each time like broken rungs on a ladder." Finally, she signed. The pen touched paper, and the ink sank deep like dry earth, drinking first rain. We lost tens of thousands below value. No one buys a home where a story stands in the foyer, staring you down. On moving day, the sky dulled. The truck's cargo door yawned open. The canvas smelled of old dust. I wrapped the dining table, still stained faintly with apple pie, in thick blankets. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Somewhere else," she whispered, "where no one knows me." I watched her back grow smaller as she walked down the steps. Freedom, when it stands alone, sounds a lot like emptiness. Sarah stopped by and slipped a warm chicken sandwich into my hand. "Eat, Dad," she murmured. David hugged me tight. We didn't speak of the past, just lifted boxes, each heavy enough to prove we still had bones, still had family. When the truck swallowed the last box, Eleanor turned and said softly, "I'm sorry, Joe." "Don't apologize to me," I replied. "Apologize to yourself." She nodded and left. That night, I returned to my workshop. The yellow lamp swam across the dusty floor. My black notebook weighed heavier than usual. I opened to a fresh page. Fallout. Community shunned. Work lost. House sold low. Gone far. I added one more word, sharp as a thin saw blade. Alone. Some sentences are never written in a courtroom. They're signed at silent dinners, unanswered calls, and glances avoided in grocery aisles. Children still ride bikes beneath the maples. The cobbler shop still hangs its little "closed on Sunday" sign. Life flows forward like a creek over stone, never looking back. I listened to the rasp of my wood plane. It sounded like my heartbeat, steady, honest. I didn't feel joy, nor fury, just lightness, like lifting a stone from your chest after years of sleep. If anyone asks whether this was sweet revenge, I shake my head. The price wasn't paid by my hands, but by the gravity of her choices pulling against themselves. But in one very human second, I wished I could turn time back, place the pocket watch against my chest again, hear that crisp click of the lid, catch the warmth of my father's palm. Eleanor left Serenity Creek on a quiet Monday. Her Sedan turned past the pines, vanished. No blessings. No curses. Just a pewter-colored sky. That night, I wrote one final line, ending isolation. I closed the notebook and set it beside my father's photo. On the wooden base, I carved two small letters, just to remind myself, Sar. Not to feed hate, but to remember that sweet sometimes means breathing freely after the storm passes. I switched off the lights. Darkness draped the workshop like a thick blanket. Somewhere outside, a night bird clicked softly. I heard my heartbeat, solid, sure, like a handplane gliding across a straight grain of wood. Tomorrow, I'll open the shop early, brew stronger coffee, and start framing a new doorway. Carpenters do what carpenters must. When the old frame rots, we measure again, cut again, build again, so that another home can know peace. 5 years passed. I was 65 now, with silver hair settled lightly on my head like fine sawdust on an old pine board. The scars in my chest never disappeared, but they stopped aching. They lay quiet, like wood grains, reminding me that nothing is perfect, and maybe imperfection is what makes something endure. The Blackwood workshop was run by David. Every morning, I still stopped by. The pine scent, the whine of saw blades, the tapping of chisels, felt like the beat of a familiar heart. I no longer held the saw. I stood behind him, watching his back straighten, his decisions sure. The boy who once cried at a splinter now handled custom projects worth thousands of dollars. When he asked for my thoughts, I just smiled. You handle it better than I ever did. And he smiled back. A smile I thought I'd lost after that old betrayal. In the afternoon, Sarah brought the kids over. They ran across the yard, tiny feet crunching through dry autumn leaves, laughing like silver bells. I sat on a rocking chair I carved, sipping peppermint tea. Watching them grow softened something in me, like sanding down sharp corners until no hand can bleed again. I learned to forgive, not Eleanor, but myself for blaming my own heart until it froze. When we're hurt, we whisper at night, "What did I do wrong?" It took me 3 winters to understand. Sometimes people leave not because you're not enough, but because they want to become someone you won't recognize anymore. One Saturday evening, I was fixing a squeaky door when someone knocked. Mrs. Meredith, the white-haired neighbor from down the lane, stood holding a paper bag. "Mr. Joe," she smiled, "the community dance class is short on partners. Come join us?" I chuckled. "I haven't danced since high school." She winked. "Then you're overdue." I slipped on my moss green jacket and walked toward the hall. Street lamps hung low, washing the road in warm amber. Each step felt heavy, then light, matching the rhythm of thought. When the door opened, old jazz washed over me, low, imperfect, sometimes skipping notes, just like life. Older couples spun slowly on the wooden floor. Heels tapped softly, like the first rain of spring. I placed my hand on my partner's shoulder. My feet stumbled. I stepped on her toes and laughed awkwardly. But after 10 beats, my body remembered. Like wood remembering the carpenter's hand. Like a heart remembering how to beat. Suddenly, I realized I was smiling. Across the room, David leaned on the doorway, arms crossed, grinning. Sarah lifted her phone to record. The kids yelled, "Go, Grandpa!" In that moment, I knew sweet revenge isn't watching someone collapse. It's standing, living well, and letting time reveal you never broke. Warm yellow lights brushed across silver hair on swaying heads. Far behind, the workshop window glowed softly. Night breeze carried the scent of wood, gentle, like my father's hand on my shoulder long ago. If you've ever been hurt, remember, scars aren't for forgetting. They're reminders you've grown stronger. And an old heart can still dance, if it chooses the right rhythm. I took a deep breath and let it fall soft. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, subscribe, like, and share, so someone out there might find a little hope. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll talk more about courage, forgiveness, and the small things that keep a family together